Hello, everyone. Distinguished guests, as Rudaw Research Center, we are very happy and pleased to have you on this panel about the impact of the U.S. presidential elections on the foreign policy in the Middle East and especially in Iraq and Kurdistan region. As we are away from the U.S. election just a few weeks, like the rest of the world, so the people in this region, they are also keen to know and to see who is going to win the next presidential race. Because any shift in the American position in this region is going to affect the security and political and economic stability of this region. So first of all, I'm just going to start a brief intro for all of you. I'm Ali Kurdistani from Rudaw Research Center with a couple of my colleagues, Mahmoud Siddiq and Diyar Kurda. They're just going to participate, taking notice on this panel. On this panel, we have Ambassador Douglas Slimman. He's the president of the Arab and Gulf Studies Institute in Washington. He previously served as the U.S. ambassador in Iraq from 2016 to 2019, and he was ambassador to Kuwait from 2014 to 16. And also, he served as the senior advisor in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs in the State Department. He also worked on Iraq issues and U.S. African Leaders Summit. Ambassador Slimman, he was also Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy back in 2012 to 2013. And also he was Minister Consular for Political Affairs in Baghdad from 2011 to 2012, and Deputy Chief of Mission in Ankara, Turkey from 2008 to 2011, and he has been in the State Department since 1984. And we have Ms. Ambassador Rand Al-Rahim. She's a co-founder and president of the Iraq Foundation. From November 2003 until March 2005, she was head of the Iraqi diplomatic mission to Washington, and she has represented Iraq before the government of the United States and the U.S. Congress, multinational organizations such as the World Bank and the international media. She has testified before the U.S. Congress as an expert on Iraq. She is also a frequent analyst on the Iraqi affairs in the U.S. and Arab and international media. Ms. Al-Rahim, she also currently serves on the advisory board of the Iraqi Initiative at the Atlantic Council in Washington. And finally, we have Dr. Andrew Parasility. He's the president and chief content officer of Al-Monitor, an adjunct political scientist at the RAND Corporation. And previously, he also was at the RAND Corporation. He was a director for the Center for Global Risk and Security and International Marketing Manager for the International Research Division at RAND Corporation. He was also a foreign policy advisor to the U.S. Senator Chuck Hagel. He was a director for the Middle East Initiative at the Harvard University John Kennedy School of Government, executive director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, and also U.S. corresponding director of the IISS in Middle East and principal at the BGR Group. So first of all, we're going to start with Dr. Andrew Parasility because the focus is going to be the first part on the U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. He has a presentation. So please, Andrew, we would like to hear your views about what's going to be the priority for whoever becomes next president when it comes to foreign policy, especially in the Middle East, and also how that any change is going to happen in terms of the impact on the war on terror and also the U.S. military presence in the Middle East and what's going to be the position of the allies in the region, and as well as what's going to be the U.S. policy towards Turkey, Iran, and the Gulf countries. So please.
Well, first, let me thank you, Ali, and the Rudaw Research Center for inviting me to participate in this panel. And it's really a pleasure to be here with Ambassador Suleiman and Rand Al-Rahim, an old friend of mine. So it's great. Thank you for the opportunity. And what I thought might be helpful to kick off, I have about 10 quick observations about what I think the impact of the U.S. presidential election will be on Middle East politics. These are short points that will meet your time limit, and I thought I'd put them out there, as a way of kicking off the conversation. So the first point I would make is it seems to me that Middle Eastern leaders of those countries that are U.S. partners of the United States have been generally okay with President Trump and his leadership. This is not the case for those who are adversarial, including in Iran. It's not the case for the Palestinians for different reasons. There may be others who would prefer a different style of American leadership. But the president has been relationship and deal focused, as are many in the region. We have seen this play out successfully in terms of the normalization accords between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain. For the Prime Minister of Israel, the presidents of Egypt and Turkey, the leaders in the Gulf, there are probably few or no complaints about President Trump, especially because of his tough line on Iran, and I'll come back to that in a moment. My second point is what the Trump administration has done in the Middle East is consequential. And whether Trump wins re-election or Vice President Biden wins, the landscape has changed, and neither candidate will, first, the next administration will face that. Like Trump, Biden has generally welcomed the normalization accords and would probably pick up that thread if elected to follow through on a few more where discussions may have started and not have been completed. A Biden administration would not walk back U.S. recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan or move the U.S. embassy back from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, for example. Third, one difference, I think, would be the approach to the Israeli-Palestinian issue that might be more under Biden, as we used to say, even-handed, and maybe linked to EU or international positions on the matter, although when the U.S. has taken a leadership role, it has taken a significantly substantial role and been the decisive player, and that's not likely to change, and that's how it's played out in all administrations. We've published articles last week here at Al Monitor that polls in Israel show strong support for Trump, not surprising. Palestinians, some support for Biden, but most Palestinians expect little or no change in policy if Biden wins. Fourth, let me narrow down a little more on Israel. I think it's harder to find a closer international relationship than President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. That said, Biden has been deeply involved in the Middle East for decades, has long-standing and close ties with Netanyahu and others in Israel, and of course throughout the region. My guess here is that if Biden wins, the U.S.-Israel relationship will remain rock solid, although it's worth noting that there is a trend among younger and more progressive members of the Democratic Party to be critical of Israeli policies. Now, the concern, and this is my fifth point, the concern among some in Israel and perhaps elsewhere in the Gulf is that Biden will re-enter the Iran nuclear deal. And I think this is a tricky one. While the EU and other signatories to the deal oppose U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA, Israel and the Gulf states have been supportive of Trump's decision to back out in May 2018. And I'm using the Gulf states broadly. We're probably talking about the UAE, Saudi Arabia specifically. Biden will no doubt, if he pursues a new Iran deal, make his first stops to the key European partners to rebuild the U.S. consensus on diplomacy on Iran. And I should mention last week we had Ryan Crocker on our Al Monitor podcast, and he said that should be the first stop rather than direct negotiations with Iran. But while there was unity among U.S.-European allies, as well as Russia and China on the JCPOA, the deal has been a source of discord among U.S. partners or some key U.S. partners in the Middle East. Sixth, a new nuclear deal with Iran comes with some caveats and catches, and Trump has been ready to negotiate a new deal with Iran, but it hasn't happened. Iran's ruled it out, rejecting to its withdrawal from the JCPOA and the policies of maximum pressure. If Trump is reelected, and I put this as a question, not an answer, an assertion, would Tehran be willing to negotiate under the Trump administration's terms? Biden, too, while also saying the U.S. should re-enter the JCPOA, has suggested updating and revising the deal. But again, Iran has said, no way. I doubt Biden is ready to offer Iran an apology or compensation, as Iran has asked for losses under the maximum pressure policy, and is demanded as a condition of new talks. Other questions I've been thinking about is we think about Iran as a key issue in American policy in the region, and if there were a Biden administration, would Biden, via executive order, immediately end all sanctions Trump imposed on Iran since May 2018, with nothing in return? The Iranians wouldn't want to begin negotiations, it seems to me, unless that happened. And we haven't even talked about the new political configuration in Iran, where President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif, they consider the JCPOA a signature achievement, in part because of what's happened under the Trump administration. They have lost grounds to conservatives and hardliners who are now dominant in the Iranian parliament and have labeled the Iran deal a failure. Seventh, I have a column about this I put out yesterday, with regard to Turkey. The U.S.-Turkish relationship is in a mostly bad way, with divisions, I should say, between Washington and Ankara over the Syrian Kurds, and the Turkish purchase and testing last week of the Russian S-400 air defense system, among other issues we could get into. Now, Trump has held off imposing sanctions, and his direct line to Erdogan may be one of the few strands that prevents a further downward spiral in ties. With either Trump or Biden, I would put it this way: the notion of a U.S.-Turkey alliance, and I'm using the term very precisely in a very Rand Corporation type of way, right? A U.S.-Turkey alliance is more talk than walk. This relationship from this day forward will be defined case by case, issue by issue, and they will be tough negotiations. Now, Biden is, put it glibly, a relationship guy too, and if he becomes president, it will be interesting to see how he handles Erdogan, who also likes this kind of direct summit diplomacy in that context. 8, with regard to Iraq, Trump's priority has been to withdraw U.S. forces, as has been in Afghanistan, Syria, and elsewhere. Biden, it seems, based upon his background in dealing with the region, and from what I think I would expect from his approach, and this would be a more general foreign policy point, not just for Iraq, he'll review everything when he comes in. Right? There's a standard process, new administration, Trump's made these decisions about withdrawing and moving forward. My guess is any new administration comes in and says, let's look at all of that. I also think you will see a more formalized decision-making process where the stakeholders, and there have been many, because we've been deeply involved in Iraq in substantial way since 2003, the military, the diplomacy, the diplomats will all come to the table and present their views. And I think they may get more of a hearing than they have in the past, because it seems to me that this administration has been driven in good part in getting our troops out. Not to say that Trump hasn't invested in the relationship. There was great meetings in Washington, Prime Minister Khatami, but that's been his approach, and that's been Trump's style. So I think there will be a slowdown in terms of the discussions on withdrawal in Iraq and elsewhere for that matter, even Afghanistan. 9th point, Biden is, and this is a general point, style point, Biden is also a believer and investor in personal relationships. When I worked for then Senator Chuck Hagel, I traveled on at least 2 trips to the region with Biden and Hagel, to Iraq, including one to the Kurdistan region in December 2002. I've seen Biden in action, even if this was years ago. I mean, when I was on those trips. He will, however, by disposition, and likely his team, be more sensitive to concerns from Congress that have been raised about issues in the region. So I'm trying to present here as well, you know, Biden is someone who puts a lot into relationships, knows foreign leaders, tries to get to know them, tries to work through the issue. More than President Trump, he will also be receptive from those inquiries and concerns of those in Congress about arms sales, for example, to Saudi Arabia and the UAE because of issues over the Yemen war. sanctions. Again, President Trump has been what I call the firewall between congressionally mandated sanctions and sanctions on Turkey on the S-400, and human rights issues, which has come up time and again with regard to Saudi Arabia and Egypt and elsewhere. My 10th point, I wind down here. You had mentioned in your question something about counter ISIS, and I'm going to make a more general point here. And I try to say this whenever I have the chance, and I write it whenever I have the chance, is at a time when the U.S. faced criticism and commentary about supposedly stepping back from its commitments in the region, the counter-ISIS mission to me is a major international diplomatic and military success. It's been supported in a bipartisan way across Democrat and Republican administrations with masterful diplomatic and military coordination in the United States and in terms of our alliance relationships, and has served to deepen our partnership, like with Iraq and others, and this is all to the good. And my guess here is that, and it's been a success. I mean, President Trump said last year we territorially defeated ISIS. Well, that's correct, and good for us. It doesn't mean that the struggle against ISIS and related terrorist groups is over. But my sense is that the mission will evolve in response to the conditions in the region as it should, because ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the like have a way of resurfacing. And I want to end, Ali, I didn't in my point say one thing about Russia. One of the criticisms of, in the political world of President Trump has been that he has been too close to Putin, despite, I would say, the imposition of some tough sanctions on Russia during his administration. What I would say here, again, no matter who wins the election, Putin remains instrumental to any eventual settlement in Syria or the Caucasus, if we're talking about the broader Middle East, somewhat, I think, in Libya, and to next steps on Iran. I mean, Russia's a signatory to the JCPOA, and Russia has advanced its interests in the region a bit. So he will have to be dealt with. I mean, if we're really looking for some type of settlement on Syria or what we're going to do with Iran, Moscow's an essential stop along the way. Biden's promised a tougher line with Putin if elected. The question is that tougher line could also include dealing with Putin on some of the issues affecting the region in a way that advances our interests diplomatically. And again, I think that's a challenge for whoever wins. And I'll stop there.
All right, thank you very much, Andrew. So I'm going to start with both former ambassadors. Rana al-Rahima to Washington back in 2003. She was actually the first Iraqi diplomat to the U.S. post-Saddam era. And also later, we're going to start with the U.S. ambassador, former U.S. ambassador, Mr. Suleiman, who is actually served under both Obama and Trump administration. So it'll be very interesting to hear his views about the upcoming presidential election, how that's going to change the U.S. policy in this region, especially in Iraq. But first of all, I would like to ask Ambassador Rana al-Rahima about your views when you were as a first Iraqi diplomat back in 2003, 2005. What do you think about in general, the U.S. relations in U.S.-Iraqi relations, and who is going to be better in your views as you've been going through all that experience, and both Democrats and Republicans when you were in Washington witnessing all that? You think if, for example, Biden wins or Trump wins, will be better for Iraqi interests or whatever you think? And then later, also, what do you think about the Iranian influence and interference, how that going to shape the U.S.-Iraqi relation? And already, as we have seen in the past years, that Iran always trying to have influence when it comes to the Iraqi relationship with the external actors, and particularly with the United States. So please. Sorry, we can't hear you. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much for hosting us. Thanks to Rudaw. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we hear you now. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Just a few broad reflections before I go into some detail. What's really striking to somebody who is in Washington and worked in Washington and still does work in Washington, which is not so very clear in the region, is how very difficult it is to completely change the ship of state in Washington, and how many factors go into the making of foreign policy. Now, clearly, the White House and the President is the major formulator of foreign policy, but the White House is not the only one. And Andrew mentioned Congress, and of course what we haven't mentioned is in the next elections, we don't know what kind of Congress we're going to have. Are we still going to have a Republican Senate or a Democratic Senate? And that will have an impact, because the foreign policy as a whole is led by the White House, but in normal times, you get a lot of input from different parts of the US government. So this sort of ship of state is not easy to turn around or turn back. So going back to the situation that we have now with the elections, I'd like to sort of focus on the things that I think will have continuity, and then things that are likely to remain the same because of sort of US policy in general, and then the differences. So in terms of continuity, I think we cannot forget that President Trump really created new facts on the ground. And this was by two things. One of them Andrew mentioned, which is the agreement and the normalization between the UAE and Bahrain with Israel. And that has really created a kind of new balance of power, or an emerging new balance of power in the Middle East. And that's something that whoever comes next, whether it's Trump again or Biden, is really going to is going to loom large in any foreign policy decisions that are taken in Washington. The other item that I think is very important that Trump created is the withdrawal of the US from the JCPOA. So even though we have heard Biden say that he wants to take the US back into the JCPOA, you can't just walk the US back from the withdrawal. You can't on day one say, well, here we are, we're going to join the JCPOA again. Even if Biden did not want to make any changes to the agreement with Iran, even if he were to accept the JCPOA as it is, and that is very unlikely, by the way, but even if he did, he can't just walk back into it. And in fact, Biden is not likely to want to go back unconditionally. He has already set some conditions, and therefore that reality of the US being outside the JCPOA is something that Trump created, and it's going to be very difficult to ignore that fact in any consideration of relations in the Middle East and in Iraq, of course. This is what we're looking at. I think the important thing, and I don't know if Andrew agrees with me, or indeed Ambassador Silliman agrees with me, is that really the Middle East is less and less important to US policy. The only important piece is Israel and the relationships that can be built within the Middle East with the State of Israel. So, for example, the UAE is now very important and has been important, and other countries, because of their relationship with Israel, their new normalization with Israel. But as a whole, the Middle East is not a very big factor in my view. And as for Iraq itself, Iraq is a rather stale topic. We've been there, we've done that. We went back into, the US withdrew in 2011 and withdrew, I think, with a sense of relief. We went back, the US went back in 2014 because of ISIS, not because necessarily of love of Iraq or because of Iraq's intrinsic importance to US policy. So Iraq is a sort of a topic that the US, I think, would rather not deal with. And that is true whether it is Trump or Obama. On the issue of what is the same, whether it is Trump or Biden, there certainly is going to be a review of policy, and one of the differences between Biden and Trump, as Andrew alluded to, is that Biden is less impulsive, he's going to be more deliberative, he's going to be more consultative, and he's going to be more predictable. And I think this will affect two issues in Iraq. One of them is the issue of troop withdrawal. So whereas a Trump continuation is likely to see a troop withdrawal, I think we're going to see a similar troop withdrawal under Biden, but in a more measured and a studied way, if you want. But the fact of troop withdrawal, I think, is going to be the same, whether it is Trump or Biden. Another thing which will be the same is that neither Trump nor Biden will tolerate attacks on US installations, US interests, and US institutions in Iraq. Neither of them. However, the reaction is likely to be different. Now, we saw Trump reacting in a very dramatic way on January 3rd of this year when the US targeted Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, also targeted officers of a number of Shia militia groups. We're not likely to see something that dramatic, but certainly the refusal to accept attacks on US institutions and US emplacements in Iraq is going to be similar. And that brings us a little bit to Iran, and we talked a little bit about the JCPOA. And I think Andrew spoke about this, but I want to sort of look at it from the Iraqi perspective. I can tell you that a lot of Iraqis, a lot of Iraqis who are not allied with Iran are very concerned about a Biden administration because they fear that there will be concessions by Biden, if Biden wins, that there will be concessions to Iran, that Iran has proposed talks, Biden has proposed talks with Iran, and they are very afraid that Iraq will be, in a way, sacrificed in the interest of those talks. I don't share that fear. I don't think Biden is going to be soft on Iran. I don't think Biden will tolerate the kind of influence, or if you want, let's be very honest, control that Iran exercises over US politics. And that is for many reasons, not just, not because of love for Iraq, but because of geopolitical reasons that have to do with Syria, that have to do with Jordan, that have to do with Israel, and that have to do with the Gulf. So I do not worry too much that Iraq is going to be sacrificed at the altar of, talks with Iran. So let's talk about what the differences might be. We're very fortunate, I think, that the strategic framework agreement has been revived, that the strategic dialogue has received a boost. I am not entirely sure that this would have happened under a Biden administration. But now that it has received this sort of impetus, this impulse, this dynamic, I think Biden is likely to continue with it. How would it be different from a Trump administration continuation with a strategic dialogue? Trump is extremely transactional, as we know. Trump wants to know a quid pro quo. If we do this for you, what will you do for us? I think Biden is much more likely to think strategically about the strategic framework agreement. Biden was for many years, and Andrew probably knows exactly how many, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, and therefore he is apt to think in strategic rather than transactional terms. So in a way, the approach to the strategic dialogue, I believe, is likely to be more constructive than a Trump administration. So Biden is likely to build on what has gone before in the strategic dialogue and build on it in a more structured way, in a way, frankly, that is more fruitful to both Iraq and the US, rather than the way Trump, and Trump is impatient. Trump would like immediate outcomes, immediate results. I think Biden is more likely to go more methodically, step by step, and wait for outcomes. Finally, it's very important, I think again, Andrew pointed this out, it's very important for Iraq that Biden will want to rebuild relations, international relations. And particularly as far as Iraq is concerned, this is particularly true in Biden's wish to go back to Europe, to rebuild relationships with Europe, and to rebuild connections. Of course, Biden has not withdrawn from NATO, although he has been, at least he has belittled the value of NATO. But whereas Biden is likely to go back and rebuild the relationship and strengthen the relationship with NATO. And I think that is very important for Iraq, because the European, I won't say influence, but Iraq needs Europe as much as it needs the US. And I think there has been a reluctance on the part of Europe to play a prominent role in Iraq at all levels. And I don't mean just in terms of, relations with Iran and so on, but Europe has been hesitant to bring to bear its soft power, if you want, not necessarily its hard power, but its soft power in Iraq because of bad blood with the Trump administration. I think if Biden can build back the relationship with Europe, that would be immensely important for Iraq. And we will see a more balanced presence for Europe and Europe's engagement economically, culturally, and on a variety of levels with Iraq, which I think is actually a healthy change. So I'll
All right.
stop there.
Okay, thank you, thank you. We're going to go to Ambassador Suleiman. First of all, I would like to ask you, since you have, as an American diplomat, served under both Obama and Trump administration, well, what do you think, is it like a main difference when it comes to Republican and Democrat when it comes to U.S. foreign policy towards Iraq? And secondly, do you think after this election, so if either Trump stay in power or Biden will be elected, where is Iraq-U.S. relation is going to, and what's going to be the impact on the strategic dialogue and also the security agreement with Iraq, and is there going to be any serious change, especially with the recent developments when it comes to the U.S. position on the militias in Iraq, as even the State Department, the U.S. government warning the Iraqi government they're going to even close down the embassy if these militias continue to attack the positions of the American interests in Iraq. But for example, if Biden is win, do you think that the U.S. is likely to approach these militias or make a deal with them through to approach Iran as well in that sense, to make a deal in general in the broader picture of the Middle East? Or in general, how do you see the both candidates' perspective when it comes to the Iranian nuclear deal and the future of the Iranian regime in this region, and also the Turkish regional interferences? So, please.
Kaka Ali, thank you very much, and to you and to the Rudaw Research Center for putting together this panel, and to Ambassador Al-Rahim and Dr. Parasaliti for already answering all those questions as well as I can. I'm going to try and nail down a little bit, or maybe drill down a bit more on Iraq policy specifically and get to some of those issues. The first thing I want to say is that I am no longer the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, and the views that I will put out here are my own views. Just as when I was in Iraq, and it's fairly recent, what I was saying publicly were the views of the U.S. government, not my own. So this will differ from what I've said before, because this is Doug Silliman talking. I will note that as an Obama appointee to Iraq, who also served under the Trump administration, I have had conversations with both Vice President Biden and President Trump and senior members of both administrations about Iraq in the region. They're now dated by more than a year since I left, but I hope that gives me a bit of a basis to talk about the difference of approaches. But as both Andrew and Ren said, I think there are a lot of similarities between the way that a second Trump administration or a Biden administration would approach Iraq. And I want to start there with the similarities. First of all, either President Trump or President Biden, as Ambassador Rahim mentioned, is going to be very concerned about continued attacks on the U.S. Embassy, U.S. facilities, and U.S. and coalition forces in Iraq, and that will be a primary focus as long as that threat exists. Both the Trump administration or a Biden administration will continue to be concerned about the lack of the complete defeat of Daesh inside Iraq and in the region, and counterterrorism will probably be a big part of Iraq policy. Both Trump and Biden will be concerned about Iranian meddling in the region, and particularly Iranian meddling through Shia militias, which are both inside and not part of the Hashd al-Shaabi, but also about Iranian ballistic missiles, Iranian cruise missiles, Iranian drones, and Iran's ability to now more quickly develop nuclear weapons. The Obama administration began the concept of withdrawing U.S. forces and U.S. engagement in the Middle East and Afghanistan, and the Trump administration has really only doubled down on that point. So I think that you will see either a Trump or an Obama administration continue a drawdown of American forces in the conflicts that have been going on for a couple of decades in this part of the world. I think as Ren said, Biden will be more contemplative and more consultative in doing so, but I think the goals are very similar. And finally, both Trump and Biden want to see an Iraq that is independent and acts in the region out of its own interest, and hopefully in some sort of partnership with the United States. What we have said since 2003 to help create in Iraq a sovereign, independent, democratic, and prosperous Iraq. That will be underpinning the specific Iraq policies of either president. Now, that said, there are going to be differences between the two. Probably the biggest difference I see is a philosophical one, with President Trump continuing to talk about America first and focusing on American interests, and a Biden presidency focusing a little bit more on what we have traditionally called in the United States American values, things like human rights or potentially ending the war in Yemen. So I think there will be a philosophical difference of approach between a Trump administration and a Biden administration. So let me talk a little bit about what a second Trump administration might look like. Basically, I think you'll see more of what you've been seeing for the past 4 years. There will be a clear focus in the Middle East on America first and transactional diplomacy, as both Andrew and Rand have pointed out. And since the Trump administration pulled out of the JCPOA in 2018, the Trump administration's Iran policy has gained increasing influence over its Iraq policy, to the extent now where I and others really see that the Iraq policy is controlled by its Iran policy and a subset of its Iran policy. Under that, you can be certain that a President Trump is going to press Prime Minister Kadhimi and future Iraqi governments to move more quickly away from Iran politically and economically, and to take more concrete steps to rein in the militias that have threatened the sovereignty of Iraq, but also tried to attack American and coalition interests in the country. There's also a very personal attitude on President Trump's part about Iraq. He has a sense of grievance that even though the United States liberated Iraq from Saddam Hussein in 2003 at the cost of several thousand American lives, tens of thousands of Americans injured for the long term, and spent hundreds of billions of dollars in American taxpayer money to help rebuild Iraq with very little effect, that at the end of all that, there's been no tangible benefit for Americans and American taxpayers. So on this tit-for-tat approach that Ren talked about, Trump doesn't see that the United States has gotten out of its war in Iraq what might have been gotten out of the war in Iraq. Quickly on Turkey and Iran. President Trump, despite the difficulty in the relationship institutionally between the United States and Turkey, still has a close personal relationship with Tayyip Erdogan. And President Erdogan has had a significant influence on Trump in the way that he has approached US policy in Syria. It's quite likely that Erdogan could have, in a second Trump administration, a similarly big impact on Trump administration policy in Iraq if it's an important point for Turkey. And on Iran, I think that what you can see in a Trump administration is continued maximum pressure sanctions, probably even increasing sanctions on Tehran for one of several goals, and depending on who you talk to in the US government, the goals seem to shift, but to bring Tehran back to a negotiation table with President Trump, to weaken the regime so that it might collapse from within, or as I heard last week from a former Trump administration official, to force the regime in Tehran to decide whether it's going to spend its money to develop the Iranian economy for the Iranian people, or to give it to the Quds Force and the Revolutionary Guards to project Iranian power in the region. But ultimately, I think Andrew mentioned this point, President Trump would very much like to do with Tehran and President Rouhani what he did with Kim Jong-un, what he's done with Bolsonaro in Brazil, with Putin. He wants to sit down and have a face-to-face discussion and cut a better deal with Iran than President Obama was able to get in the JCPOA. Let me go now. This is where President Biden, I think, is going to differ. First, I want to clarify one urban legend, which has kind of gotten to the point of myth in Iraq. Joe Biden doesn't actually support the breaking up of Iraq into 3 separate countries. This idea comes from, I think it was a 2005 editorial that he co-wrote with someone else before he became vice president, the point of the editorial was really, since Iraq is such a diverse country economically, religiously, ethnically, a federal system where Baghdad has some control over national issues, but autonomous regions like the Kurdistan region or provinces have greater control over their own administration and raising of revenue, like we have in the United States, it might be a more effective way to govern Iraq. And since he was, during the Obama administration, Mr. Iraq, this is an attitude that I think has been blown out of proportion. He would probably support greater federalism and greater autonomy to provinces and autonomous regions in Iraq, but does not want to see a breakup of the country, at least in my discussions in the past. I think that you will also see, as Ren pointed out, Joe Biden returned to a more traditional foreign policy in the Middle East in general and with regard to Iraq. And particularly, as Andrew said, Ryan Crocker pointed out, starting with dealing with our closest allies in Europe, the EU, NATO, and some of our Asian allies, before he takes a major leap into Iran or Iraq or regional policy. It's important that he get back on a sound footing, the relationships that have been most productive for the United States since the end of World War II. I think to some extent, a Biden administration will have an Iraq policy that is more focused on Iraq and not on Iran. But there will also be, as I said, continued and strong pressure from the United States on the Iraqi government to safeguard American interests in Iraq. I think the biggest difference, though, is going to be on Iran policy. Under a Biden administration, I think that Iraq policy will be influenced by Iran policy, but it will not be subsumed by that policy. It won't be a subset of Iran policy. And it is clear that if Biden is elected, he's going to want to return to something that looks like the JCPOA. But I agree with Andrew that he is not going to simply re-enter and lift all sanctions on day one. I think the Democrats are now looking at evaluating the good that the maximum pressure campaign has done, the leverage that the possibility of removing these sanctions on Iran can give them in negotiations with Tehran. It is also clear, at least in my mind, that the Obama administration, when they negotiated the JCPOA, listened to our European allies, to some extent to Israel, and focused on nuclear weapons and thought they would not be able to have a successful negotiation on all of the problems with Iran, the additional ones being Iranian adventurism and support for militias in the region or their ballistic and other missile programs. I think a Biden administration will have to take these additional things into account, which will make negotiations or even agreeing to negotiations with Tehran more difficult on the other side. I really haven't gotten down into too much detail. I will stop there. I think I've probably raised enough questions to continue discussion, but as I said, I think that this panel has gotten an awful lot of things. There's not enough disagreement on this panel. I think we're all basically in agreement on what we see for the difference in the two administrations.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm going to stay with you, actually, just a follow-up question regarding the U.S. policy towards the KRG. Do you think, like in this next election, U.S. election, so whoever becomes president, so as you, I think this was when you were here, when the U.S. laid down the foundation of the biggest consulate in the world. So how do you see the U.S. position on the KRG in the next 4 years, let's say, in terms of the providing military and economic support? How do you see that? Do you think that the U.S. support to the KRG will increase or will stay as the same? And also regarding to Rojava, how do you see the next administration will deal with that?
Boy, let me start with Rojava first, because I think that's it's a more tricky problem perhaps, but maybe easier to answer. Under the Trump administration, as I said, I think that Turkey has had a significant influence on the way that President Trump deals with issues of Kurds in Syria and the linkages between different Kurdish factions and areas across the region. I think that a Biden administration is probably more likely to have a policy dealing with Rojava as opposed to a policy that deals with Syria or Turkey or Iraq or Iran or anywhere else that there is a Kurdish population. As for the Kurdistan region, as I noted, Joe Biden very much supports the ability of different parts of Iraq to manage their affairs in a very unique way, the way that Kurdistan is doing right now, with different economic policies, different laws and practices on investment. And I think that that would continue under a Biden policy. No matter, whichever president is elected, either President Trump or President Biden will continue, however, to see the Kurdistan region through the lens of Iraq policy. I don't think either one is going to significantly change the very foundations of our Iraq policy, really laid down by President Bush in 2003 with the initial invasion and replacement of Saddam Hussein. There is some support in some political circles in the US Congress to support independence for Iraqi Kurdistan. There is some support, probably more support in Republican circles than Democratic circles for that same issue. But the consensus in both parties is still very strongly for helping develop the Kurdistan region within a unified Iraq. Again, we can get more into this later. There may be ways that that policy could change over time, but it is, again, as Rand mentioned, Iraq in general and the Middle East are going to, in the first year of a new administration, have far less priority for Americans. We are now focused in our elections on domestic issues, our own economy, how our country is dealing with the coronavirus, and issues of foreign policy are going to be secondary or tertiary. And the question of Iraqi Kurdish independence, the question of Rojava, the question of PKK and Kurds inside Turkey, these questions will be addressed only in the deep bowels of the foreign policy wonks like me in the State Department and the Defense Department and think tanks. It's not going to be foremost on the mind of either a President Trump or President Biden. So I think any development of these issues will be pushed a year or more into the future, unless there is some crisis that focuses the attention, which is what sometimes overtakes the focus on other issues.
All right, thank you. I'm going to go back to Andrew. So, regarding to the growing the Russian and the Chinese influence in the Middle East right now, so do you think the next U.S. administration is likely to have like an understanding with Russia and China, or make a deal with them in terms of how they can either collaborate, or U.S. still will see them as a competitor in the Middle East, especially when it comes to Syria and Iraq and the Gulf?
I think that's a good question. I think that they will. Let's start with Russia, and I talked about that for a little bit. I tend to believe that any answer in Syria, as I said, somewhat in Libya, and an engagement with Iran involves pretty intensive diplomacy with Russia. Now, President Trump has had, I think, a good personal connection with President Putin. And we saw after the Helsinki summit, of course, the press at the time was all about, what Trump and Putin actually said, and they're meeting together, et cetera, et cetera. But if you follow the traffic carefully, what the Russians were saying, if you read John Bolton's book, what you see is they talked a lot about Syria, and Putin went in with a plan. And in fact, in Bolton's book, Trump comes out and said he even talked about Syria. And Putin tried, unsuccessfully, to try to implement some type of understanding in Syria regarding Iranian positioning of its forces and its groups in relationship to the Israeli border. Didn't work. I see Putin as an instrumental but not decisive player in Syria. I don't think anyone is all that decisive right now. You have a number of factions. But you got to deal with him at some point. And that matters. I also think the next Iran deal, Russia's a signatory to the JCPOA. Russia dangles the possibility that it may sell arms to Iran now that the arms embargo is lifted.
The challenge for Trump or Biden is, what does Putin want in return? He doesn't work for free. And the engagement with Russia is not limited to the Middle East. There are issues in Europe and Ukraine and elsewhere. So for me, I don't have an answer. I'm just kind of kicking the question back to you. Yeah, I think that's going to be a big challenge for the next administration. And I think you have to work out that relationship, or you're not going to get to a constructive answer on Syria or Iran, just to pick two issues in particular. China still is not the decisive political player in the region. So again, they're important on the Security Council, but if the US and the Russians work something out, they tend not to obstruct. And by the way, I would say on the US-Russia issue in particular on Syria, I mean, you're not going to mobilize the UN and the UN Security Council until you have some consensus between the United States and Russia. It can either be a forum for us to present adversarial views on the conflict or constructive solutions. Take your pick. The Chinese really haven't gotten deeply involved there, although we do see through Belt and Road and all their initiatives, the inroads they're making throughout the region economically. What's also fascinating to me, and no expert on China, or China, some of the states in the region look to China as not only an alternative model, but one issue that came out in the Arab Youth Survey, which was fascinating recently, was that many Arab youth saw China as more of a leader than the United States on COVID-19, for example. And I think when you talk in the Gulf, there's an interest and an intrigue, not that they see them, China, as a replacement or anything like that for the United States, but the importance of Chinese power, engaging them economically, understanding what they can get, develop those partnerships in a wide range of areas. And if China eventually takes the political and military steps commensurate with the kind of economic policy they've instituted with Belt and Road, then I think they'll be even more formidable, but they haven't quite gone there just yet.
Just staying on that question, Andrew, so like since the Obama administration and even under Trump, so this issue about the America is more focusing on Asia Pacific these days, like militarily and economically. Do you think in the next administration, I mean, like that will change shift the U.S. position on the Middle East a bit, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, you know, Obama made a big point of the pivot to Asia, and you have the war in Syria, and you have ISIS, and you know, the world doesn't always allow you, and events don't allow you that luxury to focus on one thing. Asia is very important for the United States. The relationships are long-standing. The economic importance is much greater than the Middle East. The attachments, person-to-person contacts, institutional contacts are so strong. The security issues remain paramount as we worry about Chinese military role, and especially in the South China Sea, our relationship with Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, dealing with the nuclear North Korea. I mean, these are huge issues. So my only answer there is, you know, yeah, Asia is more important, tends to have higher priority in U.S. policy than the Middle East, but the Middle East is really important too. You can't take your eye off it. Those relationships matter for any number of reasons. And the next administration, like previous administrations, are going to have to focus on Asia as well as the Middle East. It's just the way it is. I don't think you can turn away from one and look at the other.
All right, thank you. I'm going to go back to Ambassador Ronald Rahim. So throughout these years since the Iraq War, so the U.S.-Iraqi relationship in general, let's say, was mostly related to those were seen as pro-American, or those were pro-Iranian, or they had different kind of a background. So you think that's why the U.S., like when it comes to diplomacy, so always when it comes to the relationship with the Iraqis, so they had to like meet them all separately, the leaders, the Kurds, the Sunnis, and the Shias. even that's continued until today. Do you think that's how this kind of a personal relationship, do you think the U.S. is always keen to invest in, like, for example, right now Qasem is seen as being backed by the U.S., so maybe there are some other leaders, if tomorrow they have a chance to become prime minister or president of Iraq, if the U.S. is not going to support them, how do you think that will play in terms of the Iraqi-U.S. relationship in the next administration?
Yeah, I mean, the current Prime Minister, Mustafa Kadhimi, if I understood your question right, because I was having problems hearing a bit, Prime Minister Kadhimi has insisted on what you might call sort of a balance in Iraq's relationships with its neighbors and as well as the sort of powers outside the neighborhood. In other words, Mustafa Kadhimi wants to say, okay, yes, we need a very strong relationship with the US, and we are reliant on the US for all sorts of things, most notably, our relationship with the IMF, the World Bank, a whole array of doors that only the US can open, and of course security issues and intelligence and training of the Iraqi security forces and so on. On the other hand, we have, 1,400-kilometer border with Iran, cultural relations and so on. So Mustafa Kadhimi is trying to play a very difficult balancing role, which you might call sort of it's not neutrality exactly, because neutrality is has a negative tone to it, but not going in one direction or the other to the extreme. Now, the problem with the Trump administration is, and actually, I don't want to say the Trump administration, because the Trump administration has various views and various individuals with different sort of styles and approaches. But President Trump himself thinks in a binary way. You're either with us or you're against us. Okay, so, and this puts Iraq in a very difficult position, because sure, we want to be with the US, but we can't be totally against Iran.
Yeah.
In a way, what Mustafa Kadhimi is saying, we want sovereignty, we want our independence, we do not want foreign interference, and by the way, we don't want foreign interference by anyone, okay, not just by Iran. President Trump doesn't think in those terms, and it might be easier under a Biden administration to work in the gray areas, so that life is not in black and white, but to work in those gray areas and be able to come to certain accommodations so that Iraq is not required to be totally against Iran in order to be a friend of the US. So I don't know if this responds a little bit to your question. I think it'll be easier to have a balance under a Biden administration than it is under a Trump administration. Now, whether this is good or not good for Iraq, I'm not making I'm just describing what I think may be the situation under this administration or that administration.
All right, thank you. I'm going to go back to Ambassador Slimane. So first of all, the question regarding to the U.S. withdrawal from Iraq. I mean, as recently we heard this warning from the State Department, Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, about the closure of the embassy. Do you think, so for now, it seems like more quiet the situation, but if that's going to be more like attacks is targeting the embassy or the other U.S. interests in Iraq, do you think by the end the U.S. will shut down the embassy even if it is temporary, and also will will withdraw the resources from Iraq as a sort of a pressure card on the Iraqi government? That's my first question. And the second one regarding to the U.S. and Iran, like sort of common understanding sometimes about like certain figures. Like, for example, now they say Kadhimi, he has been accepted by both the Americans and the Iranians as well. Do you think in the next administration, either Trump will stay in power or Biden win? Do you think that there will be sort of understanding between Iran and the U.S. over Iraq?
Right. On the first question about the U.S. Embassy and or the withdrawal of American forces or coalition forces, it's not as simple a calculation as they will all stay or everybody will go. There are at least 100 variations in between those two outcomes, nothing happening or that being completely withdrawn. And the question for the Trump administration or for a Biden administration going into 2021 is, what are your goals in Iraq? If your goal is to help support Prime Minister Kadhimi, if you believe he is someone who has been more able to put in place practical steps to increase Iraq's sovereignty and maybe can deal with provision of services, corruption better than others, and you want to help him succeed, then you have to have in place one set of policies. And frankly, having an embassy in Baghdad would be a really important thing to do if you're in that process. On the other hand, if your goal is to absolutely prohibit the possibility of any American casualty in Iran at the hands of a militia group that may be supported by Iran, then it makes sense to withdraw everybody because you remove the targets. The reality is that U.S. policy is a blend of these two sort of contradictory policy goals. We still want to see Iraq succeed politically, economically, socially, and broaden its real alliances in the world and become a stronger country. We also do not want to see any American casualties among civilians, diplomats, or military personnel. And what I think is going to have to happen is a balancing of these two interests. And this is there are a lot more goals than just those two. I don't imagine there will be either everything will stay the way that it is now or that we will completely withdraw. I can see, however, a continued reduction in the presence of American and coalition military forces in Iraq, partially because, and I've heard this publicly said by a number of people like General McKenzie, the commander of the U.S. Central Command, the Iraqi security forces in general, including some of the subsets like the Peshmerga, the counterterrorism service, parts of the army, parts of the federal police, have increased their skills and their ability to do the kinds of operations that are needed against Daesh, especially north of Baghdad and around Kirkuk. What is really lacking right now is mentoring and encouragement to Iraqi forces to cooperate better so that you can have easier interaction between the Peshmerga and the Iraqi army or the counterterrorism services, for example, or between the counterterrorism service and the Iraqi Air Force. And this is the level that American training and mentoring has gotten to, and coalition training and mentoring, to help Iraqi security forces and all of those that are undergoing this kind of training and mentoring to work better with each other and be more effective in fighting terrorists, especially Daesh, and in providing more security on a day-to-day basis for average Iraqis. So again, as long as progress will still be made through some sort of international coaching or mentoring of Iraqi security forces, I think the international security forces will want to maintain some presence there. And I think the Iraqi government at some level is going to want to have that kind of training and mentoring continue into the future, even though the numbers of forces may be lower than they are now.
Just staying with you, Ambassador Slimane, regarding to the U.S. and the KRG relations. As you know, because of it's like the same for Iraq, the same for the KRG when it comes to make a balance between the regional actors, especially with Iran and also with the United States. And obviously the KRG, in terms of its position with the U.S. as like since January like attack on Soleimani, and also the recent attack, the militia, they made it on the towards the Erbil airport. So because the KRG by the end, it's like an ally of the U.S. So we need to like basically, of course, pay the price as well. Sometimes of being an ally of the America. So do you think, but in the future, like in the next administration, if for example that kind of escalate these tensions between the militias and America, and also between the Iran and the U.S., and we are like in sort of in the middle of that kind of tensions happening, do you think America will guarantee like securing the Kurdistan region if tomorrow there will be like any further attacks by either as a message or anything from Iran or from the militias?
Boy, that's a wildly hypothetical question that I really can't answer, because I'd have to know the circumstances that are happening at the time that took place. I know that at the time of the attacks by the PMF on Kirkuk in 2017, I guess it was, there was a lot of pressure behind the scenes from the United States to break off those attacks and walk them back, only partially successful. Whether the United States would physically bring in troops to defend Iraqi Kurdistan, that would be a decision that would be made only by the president based on his evaluation of the interests at that time. What I think is more likely is that either President Trump or President Biden will want to continue the very close and special relationship between the United States and the government in Erbil and the Peshmerga to make sure that we never have to make a decision like that there is enough coordination and that there is enough interoperability and goodwill and camaraderie between Baghdad and Erbil that the United States, perhaps our European and other allies who have participated in Iraq in the past, can hold off and prevent the kind of crisis that would require the intervention that you just asked about. It's a longer-term approach to make sure that relationships between Erbil and Baghdad remain strong so that there is never a crisis that is that dire.
All right, thank you. I'm going to go back to Andrew. So basically, like a couple of separate questions. One of them is just about like Trump has been seen in the past 4 years as like he's when it comes to foreign policy as made the U.S. government policy as a one-man policy. Do you think if he re-elect again, do you think he will change, like in terms of his engagement with the international organization and also internally inside America with the U.S. Congress, intelligence, and the Defense Department and other organizations inside the U.S.? And second question is about the U.S. policy in Syria. I mean, I know you have mentioned in the beginning, but so a lot of people like believe that there is no clear policy, U.S. policy over Syria. I mean, like even Trump saying that we were standing in that north part and like protecting the oil fields. But do you think if tomorrow Biden will be elected, that policy is going to be changed? I mean, so far, I mean, there is no idea about regime change in Syria. I mean, the situation of the Kurds and other entities is very unclear what's going to happen like in the future. Even that oil company that had signed that deal with the local administration in Rojava, it seems like doesn't have like official U.S. government backing. So please.
With regard to Trump's foreign policy, national security style and approach, I think what you see is what you get, and that's what you'll get for another 4 years, is how he's managed policy until now will be how he's going to continue to manage policy. I tried to point out in my, introductory comments that, it's his style to talk to world leaders, and that's where the action is, and we work out a deal, and the aspects could change, at any time. And he doesn't bring a lot of baggage to each conversation in some ways, depending on how he's defining the interest. And think about this. When the United States hit Syria, and I'll use this as an example because that was your second question, in 2017 for the use of chemical weapons, if you read Bob Woodward's book and other accounts, he wanted to really hammer Assad. On the other hand, he wants to call him to try to get our hostages out. He's got a great relationship with the Chinese premier until he has a trade war with him. And I think it's the nature of this kind of style where things are operating at that level. In some ways, we're talking about a region where personal relationships matter, where who you talk to, when you talk to counts. I think that's been part of Trump's successes and like the normalization agreements and so forth. In other ways, it's intensely complicating in other kind of more intractable issues like the war in Syria. You know, I don't have any good answer or insight on what would change and what wouldn't. And this is just me talking and my own analysis and my own thinking about Syria, and you've gotten a hint of it in some of my earlier remarks. It's so hard to deal with Turkey and Syria. There's been so many divisions. We don't deal directly with the Iranians or the Syrians. Those are the three most impactful regional powers operating there. And we don't talk, we have problems with Turkey and we don't talk to Iran and we don't talk to Damascus. Obviously, we work closely with Israel. To me, the answer begins in figuring something out with the Russians on Syria. And there's going to be no perfect ending, and it's been a tragedy for the Syrian people time and time again. But I don't know where else to start, you know, except in a way that helps to organize the UN Security Council, which by implication means the international community, to organize its resources and diplomatic muscle to try to get behind some aspect of the reconstruction and rebuilding of Syria. We have half steps, small steps in terms of humanitarian assistance and corridor, and the U.S. has been very general in humanitarian relief, but as we all know, humanitarian assistance is not a substitute for a real economy. And I'm, again, I get the complexities. There's Assad, there are all these issues around it, and it's tough to handle his staying in power, but there he is. And with regard to how Biden administration will deal with it differently, you know, I don't know. I mean, you go back and you look at the Obama administration debates, there were some who wanted to be more assertive during the early days of the popular uprising, wanted to be more supportive of Syrian opposition groups. I don't know if that type of argument can be had right now because the military balance on the ground is so much more favored toward Syria and Russia, backed by Russia and Iran. I don't know if they have that. I believe that in an interview a while back, Tony Blinken, who obviously play a key role in the Biden administration, said they probably keep things kind of where they are with regard to the troop forces. This is one of these things where, you know, as my colleagues here just said, it's not going to be at the top of the agenda like how we have to deal with China on the trade war or other aspects of foreign policy. And this is going to be subject to a serious review. The kind of difficulty of this is events on the ground sometimes get ahead of you, and the Syrian people continue to suffer because
all right, thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you for all of you, Ambassador Suleiman and Ambassador Rahim. Thank you for your time to be with us on this panel. I hope you'll be with us in the future as well on a different occasion and events. Thank you very much, and I wish you well.
Thank you, Kaka. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay.
That's great.
Bye.